Conversations with the Mind podcast, where we explore consciousness through conversations with interesting people. Our mission is to engage the collective mind piece by piece to bring greater clarity of mind to our listeners locally and across the planet, and to contribute to broaden the shared experiential knowledge and wisdom of existence. All right, folks, welcome back to Conversations with the Mind. I'm your host, as always, Shane Lemaster, and today we're here with a very special guest, Mr. Nate Perkins. How are you, sir?
Hey, how you doing, Shane? I'm doing well.
Welcome to the show. It's an honor to have you, and welcome. I'm excited to dig into what we're going to get into.
Yeah, thanks. I'm happy to be here. Happy to be on this show.
So I was introduced to you by a mutual friend of ours who I'll remain nameless. But he just told me, you got to get this guy in your podcast. He knows so much about, the conversations that he and I have about altered states of consciousness and plant medicine and all sorts of, psychedelics or mind altering or just ways that we can explore consciousness in general. I mean, that's what the podcast is all about. And,
Right.
Just to dig in, first question is the same for everybody. And that is, what is the title, Conversations with the Mind? What does that mean to you? How does it sit with you? And what sort of comes up for you when you hear the phrase Conversations with the Mind?
Yeah, for me, I mean, immediately what comes up is the idea of art and the importance that art has in letting us express our mind, having conversations from our mind, and then also connect with other people, meeting on a level that maybe we wouldn't otherwise. I think that's true for all art, but for me, it especially brings up the importance of literature and what that does for us as people who have to interact with each other.
Yeah. And I think for sure, art and literature, both are art, but both are
Right.
important forms of communication too. And, when we're talking about conversations with the mind, oftentimes we're referring to like collective mind or the mind of others. And so how do we have those conversations through artwork? And I for sure have looked at, Alex Gray's paintings or things like that and just felt, a deeper message that he's trying to get across to me. And I love that you're able to use that form of expression to sort of get your feelings across to the greater mind.
Yeah, I think that goes both ways too, the artist puts forth their intention with their work, right? But the reality of where that conversation happens is somewhere between the viewer's mind or the reader's mind and the artist's mind, right? It's not on one side or the other. It's somewhere in between, which is what makes it so fascinating.
Mm-hmm. But what about the idea that, if you're transmitting this message as an artist or a writer to your audience, oftentimes you don't get a chance to see the after effects. You don't get to necessarily see that interaction that it has with that person, because maybe you're not in the room. Maybe your art is
Right.
hanging somewhere else. So, there's you hope that you get some sort of reciprocal understanding. Maybe fans come up and say, this piece really meant something big to me. But oftentimes the artist is kind of left wondering whether they made an impact or not.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of the nature of the beast. I think that's how a lot of things we do in life are, right? As we end up wondering what the impact was and whether it was good or bad, And then you're right. When we're lucky, it creates new avenues and new dialogues that we wouldn't have had access to otherwise. I think immediately of our mutual friend and how I met him. I was working in the bookstore where I do, and he came up to buy a book, and he pointed at a book on the counter that he had bought a previous day when I wasn't working, and he said, "This is a great book. You should check it out." And I said, "Oh, you know what? I wrote that book." And we became friends, and that was an amazing connection that I never would have made otherwise, And I felt very grateful in that moment to have written that, to have been able to be part of that experience, that communication between somebody that I might have completely missed otherwise.
Yeah, and you're talking about your bookstore in Boulder, right?
Right. So I work at the Trident Booksellers and Cafe in Boulder.
Mm-hmm.
Manage the bookstore side of the operation.
Nice. I think, I swear I've probably been in there a dozen times, and, it's just serendipitous that we happen to meet through somebody else instead of, face
Yeah.
to face. So yeah,
Wow.
I'd like to get right into talking about why I really wanted to have you on the show, which is to talk about Cactus and to talk
Hmm.
about your books too, but specifically the plant of what Cactus is. And this is an area that I'm somewhat ignorant to, I feel, but I've had a handful of peyote ceremonies under my belt and some interaction with some of the cactus spirits and traditions that way. But I know of, I've heard of, I've never used myself, but other uses for cactus medicinally, uses for cactus as like sustenance and meals, made out of cactus.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, San Pedro is of an interest of mine too, and I have no experience with it. So um, I guess maybe we could start with, how did you get into cactus? How did you get interested in the topic itself?
Yeah. So I've always loved plants, and I've spent a lot of my life living in the Four Corners states. Right. Spent a lot of time as a desert rat, just out hiking around and looking at desert plants, and just getting really amazed by the shapes, and the experiences I would have around various species of cactus. Right. Just they've always been amazing to me.
What kind of experiences?
Well, I just the sort of experiences that you can have in a natural setting, seeing something of great beauty, right? That exists completely independently of you, and just sort of the appreciation that inspires. Um, so I think that sort of like plays a big role. That sort of regional identity in the West plays a big role for me, and so a cactus is sort of the image of a cactus is something I can sort of latch onto as part of who I am, right? Because it represents where I'm from.
Hmm.
Um, and so that makes up, I ended up writing a book called Cactus,
Hmm.
and that sort of identity of place makes up a big part of that book, but also the idea of San Pedro comes into play quite a bit. I guess I can't remember how I first found out about San Pedro or came into it, but I first used it in southern Utah in the desert, with some good friends, and we were just out camping. I had a good friend who was suffering really badly from depression. One of my best friends. This was maybe, I don't know, 10 years ago, maybe less. But he always said that like he was gonna end his own life when he was 30. Right? He suffered really badly from that. We went out and we had this really amazing time using San Pedro. A really spiritual time, a time where we really connected with each other, a time where we felt really connected with the landscape around us. And I think it changed us, and I know it changed him because he's still here with us, right? So I have this sort of indebtedness to the plant and to the experience. I really appreciate what it's done for my life and the life of those around me. I think that there's a Aldous Huxley famously said, "What? How did it about mescaline? I don't know about San Pedro, but about mescaline. Some of the compassion and some of the gratitude remain even after the experience is over. One can never quite be the same again." And I felt that that's absolutely true.
Hmm.
Yeah,
That's beautiful, and what a nice quote too. Um,
yeah,
so, for some of our listeners who have never heard of San Pedro, as opposed to any other cactus, could you go into a little bit as far as what it's used for? You know, maybe what sort of dosages or concoction did you guys take out in the desert? Is that important?
sure,
And the effects that go into that.
sure. It originates in South America, in the deserts of South America, although it's often used ornamentally in the United States. You can find it quite often, or you used to be able to, in the Home Depot garden section. Um, I've definitely found it wandering around cities in Arizona, planted ornamentally in front of malls and law offices. It's this big columnar cactus that's really beautiful. Um, so it contains, among other alkaloids, it contains mescaline, And the way that we did it is we ordered some of the cactus, some cuttings from the cactus on the internet. We took, we prepared them by taking out the seed, or taking out the spines, and removing the skin, removing the core, and sort of boiling it into this sort of terrible tasting milkshake that we kept in mason jars in the fridge for a couple days before we were able to get down there. So I think we ended up, dosage wise, I can't give you anything too specific, but we ended up doing about a foot's worth of the cutting a piece. And we drank it early in the morning and then spent about 12 hours with it. I think the effects, it's something that you sort of have to, there's sort of a price you pay going into it, because it makes you feel ill at first, right? Which is fine. That's part of the experience, and it makes you appreciate it more, in my opinion. And we spent a long time just walking through the desert, looking at things, talking to each other, or else just sitting quietly. There's sort of, I think the main thing that it does for me is that it sort of removes the filters that you have in your brain and in your eyes, and lets you see everything so much more clearly, just even, physically. And then that sort of crosses over into sort of a spiritual or communicative understanding. You don't, everything, I always think when I'm using it, that the backgrounds to everything, the horizon line looks like the background in an old Super Nintendo video game. It sort of flattens everything down, but gives you the detail. We spent a lot of time just looking at rocks, actually, and it was amazing.
Mm-hmm. What did that really taste like? What did the brew taste like?
Oh, it tastes like a gravy made out of soap.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Not
so good. Yeah, but it's okay, And the more I did it, the more I just had my body had an immediate response to it, over the years, where it was really hard for me to get it down because my body didn't want to. So I've taken a little long break now with the idea of marrying again.
But you mentioned like stronger visuals with that, with San Pedro in particular, than I've experienced with peyote. Peyote isn't so much been a visual experience. I mean, there's a few little things that I've seen here and there that I think were spirits, but for the most part, it was all internal. It was moving energies, and you definitely paid that price too. There's a lot of purging and vomiting and things like that go into a peyote ceremony, but that's all part of the tradition behind it. So,
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it is more internal than it is visual, San Pedro as well. And I think you end up projecting that experience outwards, right? And so you still see the spirits in physical things, or you see more detail of the world around you. But really what's happening is that you're taking what's happening inside and sort of pushing it out onto what you see. I don't know. It's not incredibly visual, but I think there is an element of that.
But I like this idea that you're bringing up right now about the projection, right? The projection from the inner world to the outer world, and vice versa. And I think that's an interesting aspect of consciousness, and with altered states in particular, and how it shows us the many sides to this thing. It shows us different ways to look at what is this thing that we're in, this consciousness that we're all experiencing, and different medicines show you, different paths to, the same eventual conclusion. But I love the variety in the journeys.
Right, and I think that's why, those medicines can be so valuable to the artist, right? Is they sort of just open this tiny little crack. You can. It's not necessarily that you're seeing anything more than you've ever seen, but you have the understanding that there's more there than you've ever seen, right? Maybe you're seeing a little bit more, but there's this understanding that there's just so much, this entire realm that's unknown to you, and experience and life and reality, right? And that, I think, being inspired by that on some level can be really beneficial to the artist, and allow an artist to sort of understand how to better communicate and interact with their reader or their viewer, whoever.
Yeah. There's this thing that just popped in my head as you were saying that, and I think altered states of consciousness and seeing more of what's actually there all the time, and coming back from that can be inspiring for lots of people. But then there's, this whole other side where, you experience that for a little while and it becomes so beautiful, so appealing that we can lose touch with what's around us every day, our everyday reality.
Absolutely.
And so,
Absolutely.
and so that's a big question that I've had in my life and my journeying experiences. I'll come back from these monumentally shifting experiences and just be like, okay, now how do I go to work the next day? Like
Right.
literally none of this
Right.
even matters. And so for you,
Right.
how do you ground yourself? How do you land back into this everyday consensus reality that we're in, having the knowledge that you just witnessed, what's really there all the time, and that it's still there all around you, even though your perception is not attuned to it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if I'm really the best at that. I mean, what I try to do is I try to have those experiences pretty sparingly, avoid the idea that that's the only way I'm going to tune into reality, right? Because the consensus reality is also a reality, right? And it's also an important reality because it's the one in which we predominantly live. And I think maybe using medicines like that, I think of it as like, I think of it as a nail affixing a board to another board, right? You drive a nail into a piece of wood, and by nature that has to create a hole, right, in the reality that existed before. But it's through that hole that the two pieces of wood can be bonded together, right? But I always think that, if I go back to it too often, if I try to increase the size of that nail, right, and get more of a connection, it doesn't actually work that way. It's like driving a railroad spike into a board, and really all that does is just split the board and break it and leaves it unattached to anything, right? There's sort of this lostness that happens, and then sort of feel that you can never be grounded again or something. That's the fear. But I think using these medicines in certain lower threshold doses is a good way to actually, at least in my experience, get me to understand the world around me and the consensus reality even a little bit better than I would have otherwise. I don't know. That's a hard question. I don't know.
So you're talking about, microdosing, almost like microdosing Cactus.
Yeah, which I've done a little bit. Mostly I've just done, threshold doses.
Mm-hmm.
But I think either way, you can use those experiences to create more of a connection with those around you and the world around you, rather than pull you away from that.
Yeah, I would agree with you. My relationship with psychedelics has changed so much since I first started as a teenager, where it was, I wanted to be in that space more than I wanted to be in this reality, and I would really try and do it every day. And now my relationship is that, certainly I have much more respect and veneration for these medicines, all of them, synthetic or plant. But it, I don't know. The frequency is much less. I make sure that I have adequate integration periods afterwards to be able to fully take advantage of the medicine work and like reground myself. And sometimes that takes longer than others. I mean, you said you were on a break too. It's been a while for you too. So I mean, sometimes we need a longer integration to make the shifts, make the understanding and the information, the data useful in our life.
Right. I mean, that's like perfectly reflects that Terence McKenna quote, right? Like, when you get the message, hang up the phone, right? That the psychedelics are an instrument, like a telephone, right? Or like a microscope, he says. A biologist doesn't spend all of his time looking in the microscope. He sees what he sees in the microscope and then goes out and works on it, right? So I think that's really important to remember.
Yeah,
Or
and
did I say Terence McKenna? That's Alan Watts. I'm sorry.
okay. Yeah, I probably misquote people all the time on this show.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, I was listening to one of my good friends speaking the other day, and he said something that really was profound to me. And he said he was talking to one of his gurus in India one time, and he said his guru was dying, and he was like crying and grieving the loss of the life. And they asked him why. His disciples asked him why, and he said, this is probably the most beautiful illusion I've ever been in. And it just
Yeah.
reminded me that this everyday life is the trippiest shit that we're ever going to experience anyway. And the psychedelics and the medicines, they show us a little bit more of it, but we're here in this incarnation, in this body, in this type of consciousness every day for a reason. We're here to experience this beautiful thing.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense.
Yeah.
And I think forgetting that or avoiding that with the use of psychedelics or medicine is a problem. I don't think that's what they're for. Not for me.
Yeah. That's good. So I wanted to ask you this. This is actually a question from my wife, because she's been to a couple of peyote ceremonies with me, and she and I have had long talks on the drive home from these, these beautiful places, these beautiful vistas in Colorado. And sometimes we talk about, whether the tradition that we just experienced, and usually it's through the Native American church, and it's a teepee ceremony. And we ask, I wonder how close that is to the real thing, to the real tradition that was around thousands of years ago. And we ask, has the U.S. and our culture sort of appropriated some of the tradition and left out some of the other traditions? And we're doing either a disservice to the thing, or is this just how it spreads naturally, and this is how it evolves?
That's a great question. I mean, I think both of those things are certainly true on some level, right? I mean, so I can't speak to any traditions using this, right? I'm not a part of those cultures. I'm completely outside of that. I can't even begin to talk about that experience or that tradition. But I think that what you're saying makes absolute sense. I mean, I think there's so much that Western culture has appropriated and used, and probably messed up plenty, right? But I think that for better or for worse, that's the position we're in, and what we have the responsibility to do is to be as thoughtful and as respectful as possible. But I think that also, this is where we are, and this is how these experiences with these plants have evolved. I don't know. I can't say.
And I mean, so you're not connected to any particular tradition, but you've had these profound experiences still, I would say, mystical in nature.
Sure.
Use that term. But I'm wondering, how does your own framework, how has that informed your experience? Like I said, I've seen a couple little spirits here and there. Have you seen or been shown deeper aspects of what consciousness is, and not just the reality that you were looking at, the rocks and the plants and things, but the deeper levels? What are some of those messages that you've received from your context?
I mean, right. I definitely try to work in those contexts pretty often, even whether it's through meditation or I read a lot about chaos magic and the ways to achieve gnosis that way. And I think I've definitely had experiences, both spiritual and physical, but I don't know how to say anything concrete about them, except that for me, they all come back to the idea of kindness and respect, right? That's the most important thing.
Mm.
Is that we're all in this here together. We have to have kindness and respect for each other. So that's always what I end up with.
Yeah, and
I don't know about any other greater reality. It just always points to a simpler reality to me.
I would agree with you on that. And that's what I was sort of referring to earlier, that all these different medicines show us different pathways, but we always boil it down to, and for me, the word comes to mind is just love. Like, we're all in this
Mm-hmm.
together. And that's what I feel in those peak experiences, is just this overwhelming sense of oneness with everything. And like, I love everything, because it's me.
Right.
Yeah, it's incredible.
Right. Yeah, it is incredible. That doesn't keep you from, going to work and getting pissed off at your coworker or a customer or something like that. Just the way you might do something yourself that would make you mad.
Yeah.
But it sort of gives you some perspective and some framework with which to deal with those emotions and interactions.
So I'm super interested in what you mentioned about chaos magic, and I want to jump into that in just 1 second. But before we
Sure.
leave the topic of plant medicines and Cactus, I want to talk a little bit about your book too, Cactus. And
Sure. Yeah.
maybe you can tell us how it came to be, and let the readers know what it's about. And
Sure. So Cactus is a short novel that came out in 2018 through the press that I run, Trident Press. It was my first book. The story is that this character, Will Stevens, is living in Colorado Springs, has a lot of student debt, and got a job as a correctional officer to sort of, as a last-ditch effort to try to manage that, sort of survive. And while he's working as this correctional officer, he realizes that one of the inmates in his charge is the lead singer of his favorite punk band when he was a kid. So he sort of has to come to terms with these identities, these conflicting identities, and who he really is and what's important to him. And so that happens both externally in the world around him, but there's also, he uses mescaline, which sort of gives some insight. Yeah.
nice.
Yeah. And so it all takes place in southern Colorado, and other species of cactus come into play too.
So yeah, it sounds like it's a book about his relationship to the cactus, and that intimacy that the cactus shared with him too, help change his life and help him make these decisions about his identity.
Yeah, it's definitely a book about identity and solitude and intimacy, and what those different states mean. Yeah.
So important.
Yeah.
And those are things that we all share as humans too. I think that that journey to figure out who we are in the identity of, not just who we are in our lives, but society and larger, and, in the universe, even what is our role.
Mm-hmm.
And that search has been with us since the beginning. Such an important thing to write about.
Yeah. I'm happy with it. I've been happy with it. And some of those ideas come back into play in my second book, and certain stories in my second book, which is called The Way Cities Feel to Us Now, which is also about identity of place in the West, and sort of how that's shaped by the people and the landscape around us.
So let's get into that one a little bit too, because I grew up in the Four Corners states myself. I was born in Arizona. I lived
Cool.
in Albuquerque, New Mexico for a few years.
Oh,
and
yeah.
lived in Colorado for the rest of my life. So
Yeah.
I'd really like to know, from what you've observed, and I'm sure this book, just like, most writings from most authors, come from a piece of their own life. This book is
Sure.
probably informed by your observations. What have you seen as far as this shift in Western culture and how we conceptualize it out here?
Yeah, I mean, man. So I grew up in Utah mostly, and then I've spent a lot of time. I've lived in New Mexico. I've lived in Colorado for a number of years. I've spent a lot of time traveling in Arizona, northern Mexico, West Texas, Southern California, and I think I think what amazes me most is the beauty that I find in a landscape that's so brutal. Ed Abbey said that there's everything in the desert either bites or stings or pokes you, right? And that's true, but it's these spaces that we move through that shape us as people, right? That shape our communities, shape our societies. And I feel, I in my core feel like a Westerner, like a desert rat. And so I've tried to sort of reflect on those identities and sort of the people and places that I've moved through and have moved through me as I've been in this part of the world.
Yeah. What have you seen? What's changed for you?
Seen all sorts of crazy stuff. I mean, I spent a lot of time traveling in a van, being broke, asking for gas from people at gas stations. Spent a lot of time walking around in the desert, seeing wild animals and plants. Spent a lot of time, within these sort of social paradigms that exist in a very Western way, like the Mormon religion, cowboy culture, but then also seeing the way that this place influences the culture that comes into it, right? So a lot of my book is about punk, both music and culturally, and about the way that that sort of has to exist within the West, in this place where we are.
Mm. Yeah. So it sounds like you.
I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it totally does.
Yeah.
It draws me in because I have, that was my first introduction to music was punk in middle school, and it sounds like you have that's a theme so far through Cactus and this book too is the punk movement, and specifically the punk movement here in the West, and that's a totally different scene than the punk movement on the East or the West Coast.
Right. I think what's so interesting about punk and what's so interesting about the Western United States is that there's this long history of this culture of doing it yourself, right? You put out records yourself. You book shows yourself, within your community. Your community works together to make these things happen. You're not depending on resources from someone else because those resources don't exist. What you've got is what you've got, and you make it happen. And that's also the history of the West. This is a very harsh place to live traditionally. And the people here are tough, and they've been able to do that. And so I think those two ideas, sort of that regionalism and that cultural movement, interact really well out here. I'm really interested in sort of that Venn diagram, right? That middle part where they intersect and they share those values, and it's interesting because you don't think of that. You think of the West as like a very conservative place, right? Or a very, traditionally religious place. Excuse me. But really the culture out here in these states, in this part of the world, and the culture that I see or the aspects that I see of being the most important and interesting about punk really intersect and play together really well, which is amazing.
Yeah, I never thought of it that way with the intersecting values, but yeah, the West is very rugged and resourceful and barren. And, one of my favorite movies when I was a kid was SLC Punk.
Oh, hell yeah.
Yeah. And I loved how it showed that juxtaposition between strict religious upbringing in Salt Lake City and then the punk scene that was also there, that was totally anti organization at all. And in this one character, all these different intersections happened. It reminds me exactly of what you're describing.
Yeah, I think those things are more related than either of them would like to admit.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Okay, so I want to talk about chaos magic, and this is a topic that we've never brought this up on the podcast, probably because I just don't know much about it at all.
Sure.
And the only introduction I've had to the topic at all is through one of my favorite comedians podcasts, Duncan Trussell. And
I'm not familiar with it. What does Duncan Trussell say about
well, he just talks about one of the leading figures being, and I forget his name. I think it starts with an A. If it comes to you,
Austin Osman Spare?
no, wasn't him.
No?
But see, I don't know anything about chaos
Yeah.
magic. But he
Yeah.
just brings it up on his podcast sometimes. So you said you
Okay.
read into that for a little bit.
Yeah, so I've spent maybe the past year, my friend Jake and I have been doing a lot of reading about it. Just sort of interested in the idea, right? So let me couch this by saying that I'm still pretty new to this too, right?
Mm-hmm.
I am by no means an expert. But as I understand it and practice it, it's that the whole idea is sort of that you take these steps to make sure that what's happening consciously is affecting your subconscious and vice versa, right? You're really trying to make a bridge between the two in order to achieve desired results, either personally or within the world around you, right? And and like you were saying, there are many paths to do that. That's also something that's embraced in this idea of chaos magic, is that you can sort of use whatever tools necessary, whatever sort of spiritual tools necessary in order to achieve these results for yourself, right? To get yourself to think in a certain way or be motivated in a certain way in order to achieve these results. So maybe, you dive full into Zen Buddhism for a while, and then when you decide that doesn't work for you anymore, you become a Mormon for a little while to achieve some sort of goal. And then when that doesn't work for you, you figure out your own thing, and it's all about sort of creating these states of consciousness in which you can sort of set the conditions for yourself to meet the goals that you're setting for yourself. I mean, that's sort of, I don't know if I can explain it much better than that because I am new to it, but it's really, really interesting to me, and it seems to be very effective. I don't know.
So it seems
I would recommend. Oh, sorry. I was just going to say that I would recommend reading Condensed Chaos by Phil Hine for an introduction to that, to any listeners who are interested. And then Trident Press, the press that I run, just put out a collection of, it's sort of a pocket collection of the works of this sort of early 20th century, I guess, turn of the century, early 20th century magician and occultist named Austin Osman Spare. He was sort of they call him the grandfather of chaos magic. He was also he worked in symbolism and sort of like proto-surrealism as a visual artist as well. Really interesting. Has some really interesting ideas about different states of consciousness and how to achieve them.
It sounds like chaos magic really embraces individuality in each practitioner's journey, and also is open to incorporating any sort of religious faith or path that is chosen as well. But beyond religion, someone can choose the path of a gardener, and that's going to be their path, right? And so
totally, and you can switch paths whenever you need to. Yeah. The idea is, what do they say? There's nothing is real, everything is permitted, right? And that doesn't mean we don't have responsibilities toward each other or treating each other well, right? But when you realize that nothing is real and everything is permitted, then you can sort of move through that space however works best for you.
So this tradition, is that what you would call it? A tradition, chaos magic tradition?
Yeah, I guess so. It's just sort of a branch of occultism.
Yeah.
It's a tradition.
It almost, it feels almost like it's at a level even higher than, standard organized traditional religions, in that it's all inclusive. It doesn't cut anybody out. I almost think of like Buddhism being up on that level too. Like you can be a Buddhist and a Mormon, or a Buddhist and a Christian, or a Buddhist and practice chaos magic. And it's all
absolutely. Yeah, I think by its very nature, it's sort of rejects any organization. It's sort of, by its nature, it doesn't allow anybody to become a leader of anybody else, right? It's all about a personal journey.
So then is that where the chaos piece comes in? Like it's just up to whoever decides to practice, and that's the chaotic part, or is it about
As I
embracing the
understand it,
chaos?
it also sort of relies on sort of the chaotic nature of the universe and the way consciousness and matter move through the universe in these chaotic, non-patterned ways, and sort of being able to sort of accept that
Mhm.
in your belief or practice.
So similar to chaos theory, that there's,
Yeah, very very similar. Yeah,
yeah, so
yeah,
the entire universe is this chaos of swirling particles and atoms going any number of infinite ways, maybe even in a holographic way. Um,
mm-hmm.
but underlying all of that is bigger patterns, this organization in the chaos, amidst the chaos. Um, I think, I don't know, is that part of this theory as well, that there's some sort of,
Right. Yeah. Totally. So like if we consider the universe to be something totally chaotic, and then we also consider ourselves to be a part of the universe, right? Then we also have that chaotic nature, right? Spiritually, physically, emotionally, to some degree. And the idea is to sort of be able to access that and recognize it.
Mhm. Yeah, harness the bigger pattern, see the bigger picture. And
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, that's it's so similar to, I mostly have like a Buddhist background,
Hmm.
and it mirrors it so closely. It's amazing. Yeah, you just blew my mind. I had no idea that chaos magic was about this. I was thinking it was more about, strongly ritual based, certain ceremonial aspects. Um,
It certainly can be,
yeah,
whatever the tools are. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, I
Yeah.
had no idea though. That's really cool, and it's right on the same lines as punk too.
Yeah. There's a significant crossover. Um, the band Psychic TV, Genesis Peorage, who started Psychic TV, who started the band Throbbing Gristle, which was the first industrial band ever, was and is a practitioner of chaos magic. So there's a lot of that sort of individuality, that sort of like cooperation with things outside of you, with the resources you have, I think crosses over
Hmm.
in a big way.
Hmm. Yeah, I think when people hear um, chaos magic, it probably, like, just the term, it probably gets lumped in most people's minds in like paganism and witchcraft and all these other things like that, and it can include those, like you said, but
Yeah. Yeah.
it's not organized around any one particular thing. That's really
Right.
interesting. Hmm.
Yeah, I definitely would. Yeah, recommend reading books by Peter Carroll and Phil Hine for more information on that.
Okay. So I was hoping you could tell me a little bit more about Trident Press. Like I told you before the podcast, I have a number of your you know different publications on my bookshelf behind me.
Cool, man.
But
That's exciting.
yeah, I'd be really interested to know, like how it got started and how you got started
Sure,
in this. And
yeah. So the Trident Booksellers and Cafes, um, it's a coffee shop and bookstore. It started as a Buddhist bookstore 40 years ago this summer. Um, I started working there in 3 years ago exactly, 2017. I have a strong interest in literature, especially uh, small press independent literature is really what I'm passionate about. Um, and so I sort of, as I became more involved in the bookstore and Trident, I started incorporating some of those passions a little bit more. And my general manager, Peter Jones, came to me and asked if I would be interested in starting and running a small press based out of the bookstore, something similar to City Lights out of San Francisco, or deep vellum out of Dallas. You know, these sort of iconic independent bookstores that also run small presses. And excuse me. And that had sort of always been a dream of mine, as sort of a fan of small press. And suddenly I had the support and resources to do that. So that started mid 2017. In the past 2.5 years, we've put out 13 books. Our 14th is coming out on March 1st. It's a collection of instructions for children's games. They're they're poems, but they're instructions for these really strange and bizarre, surreal children's games. It's called America at Play by the poet Matthias Felina. And so we've put out everything from fiction, poetry, memoir, sort of collections of anarchist political theory, collections of occultist writings, sort of cover a wide breadth, but all, you know, the idea originally was to make these small pocket-sized books so that you could fit them in your back pocket and secretly read at work when you were supposed to be doing something else. That's who I want to make books for. People who are bored at work, you know, and want to be able to carry around a small book that they can access whenever they need to.
Nice. Did you ever think that you would be in charge of what you are now, this small press?
No, I mean, it had always been a dream, and I'd always had lots of friends that ran, you know, small record labels and things like that. And so I, you know, again, coming back to this punk ethos of like doing it yourself, right? Not relying on some big publisher or some agent or something like that, but just taking the art that is so important within your community and creating an avenue for it to come into the world has always been something that's really interesting to me. So I'd always thought about it and fantasized about it, but I never thought it would happen quite like this. I've been very fortunate, very grateful for that.
Yeah, and the press itself is, you know, its own form of creation, and it's almost like a different art form for you, where you get to like pour your creative energy and your, you know, what you're attuned to into, you know, this greater thing that is then going out and communicating with more and more people on so many different levels.
Yeah, it's really amazing. I mean, I've learned just an insane amount about all of it, about writing and editing and design and distribution and promotion and media engagement and, you know, just all these millions and millions of things that I would have never learned had I not been put in this position that was, you know, difficult. Not, I mean, fun, but also, you know, new and outside of my comfort zone. And it's been a really amazing experience. I'm really happy about it.
Yeah, what are your dreams for that project of yours?
I don't know. Right now, there's some really interesting and cool books coming down the line. I'm sort of focusing a lot on those and just sort of the day-to-day work that needs to happen to put those into the world. I think ultimately the goal is to make sure that these writers that I care so much about, whose work I care so much about, gets some sort of recognition, or if not recognition, then, you know, respect and appreciation. I want people to be able to enjoy it the way that I've enjoyed it. I want it to be able to affect people the way it's affected me. So as long as I can keep doing that, I'm happy.
Yeah, I mean, is that your longer like 10-year goal too, is to be doing exactly what you want to be doing and pumping out the stuff that you want to be doing in 10 years?
Hopefully, yeah. I mean, like my real goals are just to keep writing and making these connections and just, you know, just keep making it happen.
Nice. And you said
And
you were
just,
go ahead.
and that just means just sitting down and going to work, you know?
Yeah.
So as long as I keep enjoying it, I'll keep doing it.
And you said that you're working on another book right now called Wallop. And
Wallop.
yeah. Can you tell the listeners a little bit about that one? Because that one's coming out this year,
Sure.
right?
Yeah, it's coming out, I think October is when it's coming out. That's coming out on a small press based out of Florida called House of Vlad. Wallop is a short novel. it's sort of this road trip novel. It's about this gardener and landscape worker who gets his girlfriend pregnant, but already has this hitchhiking trip planned with his friend, and sort of balancing these two things. So it's about this person hitchhiking out of Colorado across Kansas and into Kansas City, Missouri, and sort of the realizations that come from the people around him and from the time spent, on the road. Much like sort of some of the greater themes in my last work. But the idea is to sort of balance the funny and the tragic, sort of the heartbreak and the humor of the ways that we move through life. So I think I'm really happy with it, and I'm really happy with the publisher so far. They're doing a great job. I'm really excited to keep working with them.
Nice. Yeah, you mentioned earlier in the show that you, at one point in your life, you went on a road trip in a van, and that's always something that I envied, that I always wished that I had done in my life, and I still might do it sometime. But just to
it's not too late.
Yeah, to just put everything
Yeah.
in something like that and go, across the country, go to South America, go up to Alaska, it would just be so phenomenal. And I was wondering if you could, share some of your experience with me and with the listeners out there. That just sounds amazing.
Sure.
It sounds so freeing.
Yeah. I mean, travel for me is the most consciousness expanding experience that we can have, right? It totally shatters what you think about what the world is, makes you see it from another perspective. I try to set my life up in a way in which I can travel as much as possible. For a long time, that meant never having jobs for very long or living in one place for very long, because I was always searching for the next big trip. So I spent a lot of time traveling. I've traveled in South America and Central America, all over the U.S., up to Alaska, and Europe, and the things that I've learned the most from doing that are just that people are people wherever you go. Good people, bad people, people have a different way of looking at things than you do. And it's definitely changed my life, and it's something that I want to continue for as long as I can. I mean, I don't have a lot of money. I've never had any money. So it's always been a balance of like, okay, being somewhere steady and being able to work and save up and then take off for as long as possible. And so that's what a lot of doing the van thing was. It's a good way to do it on the cheap. I always had a roof over my head. As long as I could get to the next place or enjoy the place I was in, then I was always fine. So I try to set myself up to be as free to do that as possible. And right now I'm really lucky because that's sort of a shared value among a lot of us that work there. A lot of us are travelers, and so we're sort of willing to cover for each other when it's somebody's time to go hit the road for a while, knowing that they'll do the same for us when it's our turn.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that reminds me of, hero's journey that we all go through, but literally, that's what you're doing, expanding your mind. So when you travel from like place to place, in the van, say, on that trip, would you like stop somewhere for a couple of weeks and get a local job to save up more money to go further? Or like, how would you move around?
So when I started, I had some money saved up. I would go and just move on when I felt like it. And the ultimate goal was that I was going to end up in Southern Colorado in a few months. So I did. I went to Southern Colorado and worked and lived at a wolf refuge outside of the town of Westcliff. Stayed there for a year. And so that sort of was like this long extended experience. And then I went back to Salt Lake for a little bit, worked for as long as I could stand, and then drove up north, ended up in Oregon and Washington and Idaho and Montana. And so there were some periods in there of a little bit more stability, but it was sort of, while I was on the road, I would do some work, maybe, do some freelance writing at a coffee shop to make a few extra bucks. Spent a lot of time eating out of dumpsters, spent a lot of time asking people to help me out with gas. And that gets pretty exhausting, But that was the way I was doing it then.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And you made it all the way up to Alaska in the van, or was the van just the U.S.?
Van was just in the continental U.S.
Okay,
Right. Didn't so Alaska was another time. Yeah.
nice, nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, you've been all over the place. Where's a place that you haven't been that you really want to go?
Um, you know what? I have never been to Peru. I would love to. I've never been to northern South America, right? So I've never been to Peru, Bolivia, Colombia, Venezuela. I would really like to get there.
So where have you been in South America, like Chile and all the ones down south?
I was in Uruguay for 2 years and then spent some time in Brazil.
Nice.
Yeah,
And those were all
and
trips
then
that.
I've been all through Central America.
Oh, nice.
What
Yeah.
was that? Sorry.
Oh, Brazil's on my it's on my bucket list because I've been a Brazilian jiu-jitsu practitioner for 13
Oh,
years now.
cool.
So I need to go back to where it originated, and Japan
Hell
too,
yeah,
because
yeah,
it first started there. But
yeah, yeah. Amazing. Yeah. Yeah, I've never been to Asia at all, but that's really high on my list too. But I feel like, um, I mean, I speak Spanish. I love Latin America, so there's some big holes in my Latin American experience that I want to fill for sure.
yeah, me too. My wife and I went to Thailand for our honeymoon a couple of years ago, and
Cool.
I'd been once before, but Asia is, I don't know. It feels like home to me over there because of
Yeah.
My Buddhist background, and you walk around and see Buddha statues everywhere, and everyone's treating everyone so nice, and um,
Yeah.
I just like this is where I need to be. And then I come back to the U.S. and I'm like, oh man, look at all the smog everywhere, and
Yeah.
you know,
It's real.
back
It's
to the
real.
grind.
Yeah. It's gotta happen. It's just part of it.
Yeah,
Part of the whole trip.
yeah. So I just have one more question for you, and that's with all
Sure.
your travels and all your I mean, when you read books, I mean, you're literally soaking in just more of these like streams of consciousness, coming into you with all that stuff, all that data that you've accumulated. What could be, um, you know, what could be your message to the listeners out there as far as advice for life, or what's been really important to you, and what's the big insight that you think um, contributes to everybody.
I mean, like I said a little bit earlier in the show, you know, to me, it just comes back to kindness and respect. You don't always have to be nice, but you do always have to be kind, and you always have to have respect for people. And I don't know if I know much more than that, and I'm still trying to work on those things. But as I see it, that's the most important thing we've got.
Yeah, I think if you could only be kind and respectful to others, then life is going to turn out pretty good for you.
Yeah, I mean, hope so. You
Yeah.
know, or at least you'll know how to go through it when it's not going so great.
Yeah, and kindness and
Ideally,
respect for yourself too. I think that's huge.
yeah,
Starts there.
yeah,
Uh,
absolutely.
well,
Yeah.
Nate, I want to thank you again for coming on the show, man. It was
Yeah,
awesome.
thanks for having me. It's blessed.
And I hope to make my way back down to Boulder, and I'll stop in the bookstore and see if you're there, and then we
Yeah,
can,
say what's up for sure.
we can meet in person. Um,
Yeah, hell yeah, like that.
well, for all you listeners out there, make sure you go check out his books that we mentioned here on the podcast. I'll put those on the description as well. Go check out Trident Press. And until next time, this has been Conversations with the Mind. We'll see you next time. Conversations with the Mind podcast is sponsored by mindops.com. You can find us at www.mind-ops.com. We're an eclectic counseling company providing mental health and mental performance services to individuals, small and large groups, teams, businesses, military, through face-to-face sessions or at a distance using phone or confidential video chat apps. We bring a unique Buddhist Western lens and specialize in general psychotherapy for all mental difficulties, sport and performance psychology for performance enhancement, addiction counseling for any maladaptive or destructive habits, and psychedelic integration therapy to make the most from your visionary medicine work.
We are available as well for corporate workshops to address the needs of your employees' wellness.